Start.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, boys and girls. I'd like to thank you for tuning in for another installment of our Civil War Time Machine. I'm Ranger John Hoptack. I'm a park ranger here at Gettysburg National Military Park. What an absolutely beautiful fall day we have here at Gettysburg today. And what we're going to do today is talk a little bit about the soldier experience. If you watched our videos over the past few weeks, if you traveled along with us on that time machine, you know that Ranger Barb was able to travel back in time and talk to Civil War soldiers doing different things that Civil War soldiers did. We talked about the equipment they carried while they were marching around on campaign, if you remember that. We also talked about the kind of food they ate when we met up with that Confederate soldier in the woods while he was preparing his breakfast. And just last week, we found a Union soldier who was practicing, loading and firing, marching and maneuvering. Well, that was a very common thing for a Civil War soldier. But you know, this week for our fourth and final installment of the Time Machine, we did things just a little bit differently. Instead of me traveling back to the year 1863, we instead brought a soldier back to the year 2019. And he's standing just over here by one of these cannons, and he's going to explain to us what it was like to load and fire a cannon, and also going to tell us what it was like to be in a battle like the one here at Gettysburg. So if you would please follow me, we're going to meet this soldier in just a moment. Hello there, Private.
Hello.
I'm John. I'm a park ranger here at Gettysburg National Military Park, and I have a lot of boys and girls watching us today, and they're wondering if you could tell us just a little bit about who you are and what you did in the Civil War.
Yeah, sure. It's a little odd being here for me, being back in this spot. The war itself was a long ordeal, but you know, it's in '61 when the war started. I enlisted originally after President Lincoln sent out that call for volunteers. I enlisted as an infantry soldier in the Union Army and spent a good amount of time drilling and practicing, preparing for battles. But then, as the war progressed and it got longer and bloodier, and we needed more soldiers to fill the gaps that were being created, eventually I ended up joining an artillery battery, which is what these are here today. You know, it was a little bit of a difficult transition. You know, I thought that this was going to be easy. I thought I was going to be switching over to an artillery job. I wouldn't need to do much, but it turns out it required a lot more work than I expected it would to maintain these guns and use them like we did here at the Battle of Gettysburg.
And it looks to me, based off the uniform that you're wearing, that you've seen a lot of hard service. Is that correct? A lot of campaigns, a lot of fights?
Indeed, indeed. It was a long war, but like I said, it was a lot of training, but it prepared us well for what happened here and afterwards.
Our soldier began this war with the infantry. And as you might know, the Civil War began in the year 1861, and by the hundreds of thousands, young men would rush off to fight to become soldiers. And after spending just a little bit of time in the infantry, learning how to march and maneuver, learning how to load and fire a musket, our soldier here decided to move to the artillery. And the artillery, these were the soldiers who fired and loaded and pulled around these cannons. Now, I would imagine that you alone could not load and fire this gun.
No, you believe when I first started, I thought that I could do that, but no, it took quite a crew of us, a team of us actually working together. Each of these guns in our battery of 6 cannon together, lumped in a battery, we would have had 8 soldiers per gun working one of these pieces just to make sure that they're functioning in the midst of a battle. There's a lot of equipment because each one of us had a different job that we would use, not just while we were working the cannons, but while we were on campaign, because most of our time wasn't spent on the field fighting in battles. It was mostly spent maneuvering and marching and going different places. And to get these cannons from place to place is quite the process, because what you see in front of you, this is just the gun itself. But in fact, there would have been 3 separate pieces here when we were here in July of '63. Those 3 pieces, you would have seen about 6 yards behind the back of this cannon called the trail, you would have seen 6 horses. And those 6 horses attached to a large, another carriage with a large box of ammunition on top of it called a limber chest. And that held 50 rounds of ammunition. But the other thing is that when we wanted to move this 1-ton gun across the battlefield, we'd have to pick up the trail of this gun and attach it to a hook on the back of that limber chest. And then we would use those 6 horses with the limber and the gun itself to pull this cannon around the battlefield. And we'd use that to pull it over field fences. We'd have to go over rocks and creeks and all different types of terrain. But also, wasn't just the gun and the limber, because another 20 or 30 yards back behind us, you might be able to see the fence that's back there. Behind that, we would have been situated with our caisson, and that would have been 6 more horses, and those 6 more horses attached to 2 more carriages with 3 more boxes of ammunition stacked up on top of that. And anytime, like I said, we wanted to move these guns, each one of them, all 6 of the guns, had 12 horses, 3 parts, and 4 boxes of ammunition. It's a lot of equipment.
Boy, it sure sounded like it. And each one of these cannons weighed well over 1,000 pounds. So you see why it was necessary for there to be a lot of horses to pull these cannons, as well as the limber chest and the caissons where all the cannonballs were stored, even during a fight like here at Gettysburg. So can you just for a moment imagine 8 soldiers loading and firing this one gun, all the horses stacked up behind with all the ammunition further to the rear? I'm wondering, Private, if you wouldn't mind telling us just a little bit about that tool that you have there. What is the name of that and how is it used?
Well, this is a sponge rammer, and this, I would have been working each of our cannons here, I should say. We would have had, all of our soldiers had different numbers, and those different numbers had different jobs. Each of the 8 soldiers did something different to make this cannon fire. Myself, I would have been working the number 1 position here on one of our guns at the Battle of Gettysburg, and that would have been standing roughly where I'm standing at right now, using this piece called the sponge rammer. You'll notice the top of it's covered in a little bit of wool that I would have dipped in some water to make wet, and I would have used this to sponge out the barrel of my gun to make sure there's no hot embers or anything on the inside of the barrel. And I also would have used this to ram the shell down the muzzle of the gun.
So someone who was standing where I am would have gotten the cannonball, would have then placed it right here at the end of the cannon. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you would have used that to push the cannonball all the way down the barrel. So, as you might imagine, it would take a lot of work to load and fire this cannon just one time. And it would take a lot of practice. And I'm sure many of you know what practice is all about. Whether you're on a sports team or whether or not you play an instrument, I am sure that so many of you practice and practice and practice. Well, the same thing was true for these Civil War soldiers, because when it got time to be in a battle, it was a very, very scary thing. And I was hoping that before we move on from our time machine, before we have to send our soldier back to his time, he might be able to tell us just a little bit about what he and his fellow soldiers did here at the Battle of Gettysburg. So would you be able to tell us just a few minutes, a few moments about what you experienced here during the Battle of Gettysburg?
Yeah, I can try to the best of my abilities, but you see, one of the things you have to understand about fighting in battle is like you said, it's a pretty terrifying experience, and we get something that we call tunnel vision, where it's really difficult to tell what's going on in the battlefield larger around us. It really only can tell you about my experience, not what somebody else was doing across the field. But I'll tell you this, on the afternoon of the second day of the battle, we ended up bringing our guns out of the reserve that we had parked back behind the ridgeline back here. Brought those guns up and over the ridge in front of us. We put into battery in a position, I think that they now call it the Peach Orchard area. And from there, Confederate advance came out of the tree line about a mile distance in front of us. And we instantly started opening fire with our guns, but this was the first time that we were in combat. We had drilled and we had drilled, but I'll tell you something, that as much drill as we did, it never truly prepares you for what's about to happen. And before long, the Confederate advance was rolling up our flanks. There were guns being pulled off the field. We could hear those musket balls zipping through the air around us. They sound like bees when they buzz all around. But before long, we had to pull the guns off. And when we hooked up the guns to we didn't have enough time to hook them up to the limbers, I should say, which usually we'd have to take our horses and pull them all the way out and around in front of the gun and swoop it back and attach them and pull them off the field. The rebel lines were coming too quick. We had to use something called prolonging the guns, and I think we have one of our prolongs right here.
This rope right here?
This rope right here would have been attached to the back of our cannon here, and we would have attached one end of it to the trail of the cannon itself. The other end was attached to our limber back in the back, and what we did is we retired by the recoil of our guns. So when we fired this cannon, it would roll back naturally, maybe 10 feet or so on its own. And then we give the horses a kick. They're attached to the limber that's also attached to the rope that's now attached to the cannon, and we'd start pulling it across the battlefield. And we'd stop every few yards or so, load and fire, let the gun naturally recoil on its own. And this way we bought some time. We bought some time for us to get back far enough to this place here. think they call it the Trossel Farm.
That's absolutely right. Where we're standing is called the Trossel Farm or the Trossel Farm, and this area witnessed some pretty heavy battle action on July 2nd of 1863. I'm not sure if you heard our soldier say this, but he was in battle here with his unit, his battery, for the very, very first time. We could only imagine how scary that might have been. And one other very important element to a Civil War battle is the terrain. Can you talk to us briefly about the importance of the ground, of the terrain all around us?
Well, you might be able to see that we're kind of down in a depression. The battlefield here in southern Pennsylvania, it has a bit of a rolling terrain to it. These ridge lines are very advantageous for artillery positions, but also for masking troops, hiding them behind those ridge lines. And when we withdrew from that area of the peach orchard, we fell back to this position here. We had bought ourselves enough time to actually limber up the guns, hook them up properly, and start escaping from the battlefield. We knew that things were going poorly for our line up on the top of the ridge. They were starting to collapse. But as we did so, a rider came tearing up down through the fields, telling us to halt. And it turns out that we were the last of the federal guns on this section of the field. We needed to stop to buy some time for the rest of the federal army to get the positions back here along the back ridge lines behind us, a reserve position. And well, that's exactly what we did. And we used that terrain to our advantage, because usually with these guns we'd have to fire in a straight line, straight out. We could probably hit targets upwards of a mile, maybe a mile and a half with one of these 12-pounder guns, but here we used the ridge lines to our advantage. We hid ourselves back on the back side of these ridge lines, right where these guns are today. We had our guns spread out in a semicircle, and we were actually using a lot of mathematical calculations, a lot of trigonometry to calculate how we wanted to ricochet some of our artillery shells. It means we would fire them into the ground in front of us and bounce them over the hill into the troops that were coming towards us. And we did that for a little while, but before long, up through the wheat in front of us came Barksdale's Mississippians, and they came crashing down through this field in front of us, and it was only a matter of seconds. We didn't have much time to respond to it, and we started firing our round we call canister. And that's it's essentially a can filled with 27 iron ball bearings. And when we fire these guns, it sprays those ball bearings out in all different directions, and they cut massive holes in the midst of their lines. But like a wave, they swooped right back together, and they started driving onto the guns themselves. But before long, we realized that they weren't necessarily targeting us. They were targeting the horses behind
Targeting the horses, because if you target the horses, you kind of immobilize the guns.
Yeah.
Well, boys and girls, I want you to think about, just for a moment, if you could ask any question whatsoever of a Civil War soldier, what would that be? I have a question that I think I'll conclude with, and my question to you, and I'm sure this is going to be a very difficult thing, but if you could summarize, or if you could just explain what it was like to be in a Civil War battle in just one word, what would that word be?
Chaotic.
Chaotic. Very chaotic, very confusing. Private, thank you so much for taking a few minutes out of your time. I will have to send you back to your time in 1863 in just a few moments. But on behalf of myself and the National Park Service and everybody who's tuning in to watch, thank you so much for explaining what it was like to be a Civil War soldier. Now, we're very fortunate here at Gettysburg National Military Park that this place has been preserved for us, for you. The battlefield as it appears today is much the same as it was when this battle was fought well over 150 years ago. So in a way, the battlefield here at Gettysburg is in itself something of a historical time machine. You could come here, you could learn about what it was like to be at this battle. You could read monuments, you could learn about how a soldier loaded and fired his cannon and his guns. So we do hope you get an opportunity to one day come to us here at Gettysburg and embark on your own journey through a Civil War time machine. Boys and girls, thank you so much for tuning in to this last installment of Civil War Time Machine.